The series X Factor is still a cult classic today, not just because of the mysterious stories, but especially because of Jonathan Frakes' legendary lines.
The human brain, incredibly far too complex for the human brain itself to fully comprehend.
After every short story, the question hung in the air, is this story really true, or
your judgment completely clouded by the unfiltered truth?
But how did X Factor actually know that the stories were true? I did some research and looked into which X Factor stories actually have a real true story behind them, and there really aren't many. Because most of the supposedly true stories on X Factor can't really be disproven and come from novels or various research materials. There are only a few fully refutable sources, and that's why today I'm going to tell you the 5 stories from the series X Factor that at least happened in a similar way. Have fun with it, and of course, don't forget to hit the like button. It always helps to push the video.
Caution. You are now about to experience a real disaster broadcast.
X Factor, The Unbelievable. Presented by Jonathan Frakes. We live in a world where dream and reality lie close together, where facts often appear like fantasies that we cannot explain. Can you distinguish between truth and lies?
The case family grave begins with a death. A young woman dies and is laid to rest in the family crypt. On the outside, everything seems like an ordinary funeral. The relatives say their goodbyes. The coffin is carried into the crypt. Afterwards, the entrance is sealed. Actually, everything down there should now be quiet. But that's exactly what doesn't happen. When the crypt is opened again later, something is wrong. Inside, there is chaos. Coffins are no longer where they are supposed to be. Heavy objects appear to have been moved by force. It looks as if something had stirred in the tightly sealed crypt, but no one can explain how that could be possible. The crypt was locked. There are no clear signs of a break-in, no open doors, no easy way in, no normal explanation. Yet the room looks as if something down there has not found peace. In the X Factor version, the case takes an especially dark turn. There is a dark secret behind the family. The deceased daughter is said to have been abused by her mother during her lifetime. Later, when the mother also dies and is laid to rest in the same crypt, the haunting begins. The coffins move, the crypt appears devastated, and only when the mother's coffin is removed does the unrest end. With this, X Factor turns an old ghost story into a tale about guilt. It's not just about the crypt, it's about a dead woman who finds no peace even after her burial. The real-life inspiration for this story is the famous Chase Vault in Barbados. This crypt is located in the parish church Christian cemetery. According to the story, members of the Chase family were buried there. What makes it especially eerie is that these were not light wooden coffins, but heavy lead coffins, and it was precisely these coffins that were reportedly found in different positions each time the crypt was opened. The real story begins at the start of the 19th century. First, a Mrs. Goddard was buried in the crypt. After that, members of the Chase family followed, including children. When the crypt was opened again later, the coffins were reportedly no longer neatly in their places. They were said to have been shifted, twisted, or apparently thrown across the room. Then the crypt was sealed again. But the next time it was opened, it happened again. Once more, the coffins were said to have been moved in the real story. Again, there is no clear explanation, and once more the question arises, what can happen in a sealed crypt if supposedly no one has been down there? These incidents are said to have repeated themselves over several years. According to tradition, openings are mentioned in the years 1808, 1812, 1816, and 1819, among others. Later, the story became so well known that it turned into one of the most famous ghost legends about wandering coffins. But we have to be honest, the Chase Vault is not a reliable, proven ghost story. No one today can definitively prove that the coffins really moved on their own. There are attempts at explanation, doubts, and gaps in the tradition. Nevertheless, the real-life inspiration is quite strong, because X Factor didn't just invent a crypt here. The series took an old, already existing legend and turned it into a personal tragedy. The Chase Vault became the family tomb. The wandering coffins became a symbol that guilt doesn't simply disappear with death. In the second case, the funeral, the story begins similarly to the first case. A woman is believed to be dead. Her family mourns. Preparations for the funeral begin. Her body is placed in a coffin. To everyone, it seems clear that her life is over. No one expects that anything else could happen. Then the coffin is closed. It is the moment when mourning becomes a final farewell. But suddenly someone hears a sound, a faint knocking, then a scratching. The noises are coming from inside the coffin. When the coffin is opened, the unimaginable is revealed. The woman is alive. She was not dead. She was only believed to be. Perhaps she was in a comatose state. Perhaps her pulse was barely detectable. Perhaps her breathing was so faint that the people around her believed she was dead. But she was still alive. In the X Factor version, this story takes on historical significance. The woman is said to later become the mother of Robert E. Lee. This changes the entire impact of the case. It's not just about a woman who was almost buried alive, it's about a moment that supposedly would have changed history as well. Because if no one had heard the knocking, she would have died. Robert E. Lee would never have been born later on. The real-life inspiration is an old handed-down story about Anna Hill Carter Lee, the mother of Robert E. Lee. In this account as well, she was said to have been thought dead and almost buried before it was noticed that she was still alive. That's what makes the story so unsettling, because it doesn't sound completely implausible. Today, such cases seem almost unthinkable, but back then, medicine was not as advanced as it is now. There were no modern devices, no reliable monitors, no intensive care medicine like we have today. If a person was breathing very weakly, had barely any pulse, or was in a deep comatose state, it could happen that they were mistaken for dead. It was precisely from this that, over centuries, the fear of apparent death arose. People were afraid of being buried too soon. There were even safety coffins with devices that allowed someone mistakenly thought to be dead to send a signal. So this fear was not just imagination. For many people, it was truly part of death itself. But with this particular story, we also have to be honest again. The story about Anne Hill Carter Lee is considered historically disputed. There is a real-life basis and a handed-down legend, but no definitive proof that everything happened exactly as described. The Lee family archive even refers to this story as a myth. Nevertheless, it fits perfectly with X Factor because the horror of this story does not lie in the supernatural. There is no ghost, no monsters, no apparition, just a human error, a single moment in which everyone believes a person is dead, even though they are still alive. The case of the dream house begins with a woman who keeps having the same dream over and over again. Not just once, not blurry, not like an ordinary dream that slowly fades away in the morning. She sees a house again and again. She knows the rooms, the hallways, the windows, and the paths. It's as if at night she returns to a place she has never actually been. At first it just seems like a strange dream, but eventually the woman and her husband start looking for a new home. They visit various houses, but none of them feel quite right. Then they come to another building, and suddenly the woman stops. She immediately recognizes it. It's the house from her dreams. It's not just similar, not just from the outside. She knows it. She knows how it feels on the inside. She knows details, even though she could never have been there. That should actually be impossible. In the X Factor version, the story gets even creepier. The house is being offered at a suspiciously low price. Only later does the reason become clear. The previous owners wanted to get rid of it because they supposedly saw an apparition there. And this apparition looked exactly like this woman. With that, the whole story suddenly turns around. The woman hadn't just dreamed of a haunted house. For the previous residents, maybe she herself was the ghost. So the house wasn't just a place she had seen in her dreams. It was a place where other people claimed to have already seen her before she had ever been there. The real-life inspiration is said to be based on an old tale about a woman named Mrs. Butler from Ireland. This story was passed down by the writer August Harry. There too, a woman is said to have repeatedly dreamed of a house that she later recognized in real life. And there as well, there is the unsettling idea that she herself had previously been seen as an apparition in that house. This means that X Factor didn't just invent any random haunted house here. The episode draws on an older traditional story in which dream, premonition, and ghostly apparition merge together. That's precisely why this case works so well, because normally a haunted house is a simple concept. People enter a house and in that house a ghost simply lives. But here it's a little different. The story doesn't just ask whether a house is haunted, it asks whether a person can appear in a place before they've ever actually been there. Maybe the dream was a warning, maybe the house was a place that had been calling to her for a long time. Or maybe, for other people, she had long been a part of this house before she even knew it existed. Of course, this real-life inspiration isn't a modern case file with evidence, names, and photos either. It's an old handed-down story. But this very story already existed before X Factor. The series turned it into a short, eerie episode that still lingers to this day. Because the real thought is quite disturbing. What if dreams aren't fantasies, but memories of places we've never been, or might only visit in the future? The case of the Titan doesn't begin at sea but at a writer's desk. An author is working on a story about a ship. Not just any ship, but a massive ocean liner. A ship that is supposed to be bigger, more modern, and safer than anything the world has seen up to that point. It stands for progress, luxury, and human pride. The name of the ship is Titan. In his story, the Titan is considered almost unsinkable. The people on board feel safe. No one expects a catastrophe. The ship sails across the dark North Atlantic, far out on the open sea, surrounded by cold, night, and water. But then, suddenly an iceberg appears. The Titan collides with the iceberg and then begins to sink. For many people on board there is no rescue. There are too few lifeboats available. Within just a few minutes, the symbol of human safety becomes a floating grave. In the X Factor version, this story feels like a dark premonition because the uncanny part is not just the sinking itself. The uncanny part is the moment when the story was written. The real-life inspiration is almost just as disturbing. The writer Morgan Robertson published the novella Futility in 1898, later known as The Wreck of the Titan. It actually tells the story of a large ship called Titan, which collides with an iceberg in the North Atlantic and sinks. It was only 14 years later, in 1912, that the real Titanic sank. And this is exactly where the uncanny core lies. A huge ship, a similar name, the North Atlantic, an iceberg, too few lifeboats, many people relying on the safety of a modern ship. And all of these things fit together perfectly. And of course, that doesn't automatically mean that Morgan Robertson predicted the disaster. He was quite knowledgeable about ships. He knew where technology was heading. At that time, ocean liners were becoming bigger, faster, and more luxurious. So it wasn't impossible to imagine such a catastrophe. Nevertheless, the similarity remains quite uncanny, because after the sinking of the Titanic, this old story suddenly no longer seemed like pure fiction. It felt like a shadow that had already been cast on paper years before. So X Factor didn't just tell a simple ghost story here. The series picked up on a real literary case in which a fictional story later came eerily close to a real catastrophe. And that's exactly why the Titan works differently than the other cases. There is no sealed crypt, no knocking from the coffin, no house from a dream. The horror here lies in the question of whether a person can describe a catastrophe before it even happens. The last case, Praise the Lord, begins like any ordinary evening in a small community. The church in the village is dark, quiet, and empty. Just a few minutes later, the choir is supposed to gather here. It's a fixed appointment every week at the same time. The singers know their places, the songs and the routines. Normally the building should soon come to life, but on this evening no one arrives on time. One person oversleeps, another is held up at home, someone has car trouble, others are late for small, completely ordinary reasons. Taken individually, each delay seems somehow insignificant, but together they add up to something that is hardly explainable, because at exactly the moment when the choir should have already been singing, the church is still empty. Not a single person from the choir has shown up. Then it happens. A loud explosion shakes the church. The building is destroyed by a gas explosion. If the choir had started on time as usual, the people inside would have been dead. Most likely, many of them would have died. But because each individual is late for a different reason, all these people are spared. In the X Factor version, it seems like a series of small coincidences that make no sense at first glance. Each delay seems harmless on its own, but taken together, they save the lives of an entire group. The real story is almost just as eerie. On March 1st, 1950, the West Side Baptist Church in Beatrice, Nebraska really did explode. The reason for this was a gas explosion. That evening, choir practice was also supposed to take place there, but all the members of the choir were late for different reasons. One person still had to grade homework, another was held up, others had minor delays that would have been completely insignificant on any normal day. But on this evening, it was precisely these delays that ensured no one was in the church when it exploded. No one from the choir was injured, and that's exactly what makes this case so special. With many X Factor stories, you have to be cautious. Sometimes there is only a legend, an old tale, or a source that can no longer be properly verified. But with Lobet den Herrn, the real core is very strong. The explosion in Beatrice, Nebraska is a documented case, so in this case, X Factor didn't just lead us on. The series told a story that sounds almost impossible even without exaggeration. An entire choir arrives late, each for a different reason, and it's precisely because of this that every single one survives. Maybe it was coincidence, maybe it was luck, or maybe it's exactly this kind of story that makes X Factor still work today. The series shows us that sometimes it's not the supernatural that's unbelievable, but reality itself.
Did this cemetery story really happen? Or do you have dark doubts about it?
Yes, friends, those were 5 X Factor stories that are actually connected to real cases. Did you even watch X Factor back in the day, and what was your favorite episode? By the way, if you're interested, you can now listen to all the stories on Spotify. You'll find the link for that below in the description. If you want to watch even more stories on YouTube, just click here in the end screen to jump to the next story. I would be absolutely thrilled, and see you next time. Take care, adios, and bye-bye.